Hey y'all, we are back with Marijuana Monthlies. My name is Chelsea Higgs Wise, and I'm the Executive Director of Marijuana Justice Virginia. I'm really excited to have you all back. I'm really excited to have this conversation today that a close partner in our Canna Justice Coalition has been working on Justice Forward Virginia. Shout out to those public defenders. Before we get started too, I want to just say a big thank you to everyone that showed up this past Saturday to the Gas Grub and Go. We were able to give out over $1,000 in gas cards, food. We vibed out, had yoga, and thank you all so much for coming out and learning more about these mutual aid organizations. So big shout out to RVA Fridges, to River City Redux, to Mutual Aid Disaster Richmond, and Repro Rising. We're really excited to have all of those organizations come out with us for that mutual aid day and to just pass out this new information about the new laws that went into effect July 1. So we know here in Virginia, July 1 is that day where we kind of got to remember that the new laws are coming and look out, follow the people that you trust on reporting what the new laws are. So I'm going to get to that in just 1 second. And, every time we get here, I just want to let you all know that our values are here really to form and organize a gateway to dismantling the racist drug war right here in Virginia and this U.S. and this entire global world that we have. And we also want to just say here in Virginia, in the so-called Commonwealth, we have at least 600 people still incarcerated for marijuana-related offenses. We have even more than that still on community supervision with ankle monitors and in city and local jails. And so these are the types of conversations that as we move forward and talk more about legalization and decrim, we have to never forget folks that are still locked inside for what we are calling quote unquote legal. And some folks are going to be making billions and billions off of. So July 1, what happened? Well, for everyone that was here last year, it was a totally different vibe. We had a whole different mood, y'all. We were in celebration. We had just really pushed the governor because he wanted to legalize and repeal the prohibition of possession in 2024. And we were like, hell no, do it now. And the former governor did that last year. So what happened last year is they repealed the simple possession of marijuana here in Virginia. Now, what we are looking at today is we still have that legal simple possession up to 1 ounce. But instead of what was legalized last year was from 1 ounce to 1 pound was just a civil penalty, y'all. So you got a $25 ticket. You didn't have to go to court, right? There was no chance of going to jail. So, but that was from an ounce to a pound. And what just went into place, y'all, is that now from 1 ounce to 4 ounces is that civil penalty range. But anything from 4 ounces and above, now we're going back to misdemeanor realm. So a misdemeanor on, if a class 3 for the first time, in a class 2, the second time in a class 2 comes with a possible incarceration, possible jail time. So we have to conceptualize that. I just said we've got a bunch of folks still inside, and now we're recreating these crimes to target more people and put them inside. And we know prior to decriminalization, we saw that the majority of people that were being targeted by these arrests were Black folks. We also know between the ages of 18 and 24 were over half of those penalties and those arrests. And so we know that young Black people are the main targets of these crimes. And we know that we are just continuing to empower the police with these types of misdemeanor crimes. And then we have to think about, well, what happens after the conviction? Well, then we have to wait at least 7 years for those records to be sealed. And that's after fines, after any other court orders are done. You have to complete all of those things before the 7 years starts. And these collateral consequences continue to cover housing, possible deportation, limits to financial aid, employment, and just many other things that we are realizing are barrier crimes that really help our autonomy and survival here as we continue to live in a pandemic. So along with that, there is also an age limit of CBD. So right now in Virginia, you have to be 21 to consume CBD. That is a change from 18 to 21. Um, and there is a new task force that is going to be established because everyone's like, well, what about the selling and the buying of cannabis, of adult use cannabis? Because that is still not legal in Virginia. And if you want to tune into some of our past marijuana monthlies, we can review and you can listen to that process. But nothing has passed. We did not support anything that was proposed because of many reasons, but many because it did not have the equity portions nor the relief for those targeted by the war on drugs. And as I mentioned, there's a task force that will be meeting between now and next General Assembly, y'all. And they're the folks that are going to create a recommendation to the legislators for next session on how to regulate, if to regulate cannabis at all. Now, last year, if you were paying attention, you remember that they formed a commission of legislators that had worked on this. I mean, just from the language alone between commission to task force makes me think cops. And when you look at who's going to be appointed to this task force, it's many of the gubernatorial appointments, people that are already in his cabinet, and then cops as well. There are some other folks that are on this task force that I'm hoping will have a voice, but their first meeting is actually tomorrow, July 7th, from 1 to 4 in the House room over at the Pocahontas building. So if you want to tune into that, and we'll be tuning in as well. Looks like they will be allowing some public comment as well. So just a quick review, there are some misdemeanors and felonies there. And if you want to look at our website, marijuanajustice.org, you can go to the Know Your Rights section and look over this information as well. There is some better news, particularly because there was some decrease in penalties, particularly to the home cultivation that was passed last year. Last year, another big celebration that we have is the 4 plants that is allowed in each home and properly labeled away from those 21 and under 21. And what happened this General Assembly was that they did create lesser penalties. Most of the penalties, if you went above 4 plants, went straight to felonies. So now there is a misdemeanor threshold within there. Up to 49 plants are misdemeanors, and then 50 and above are felonies. I just also want to let people know when we're talking about penalties and felonies as well, there's still a possession with intent to distribute that if you are caught 3 times with a particular weight, it is life in prison. So I just want to take a moment there too, that we still have laws in Virginia that can put people in prison for life because of weed. So much work to do still. But I know that this is definitely a marathon. The road is long. And I'm always just really energized, particularly by events like Saturday when I can see and feel the energy and the love with everyone, because we know that we keep each other safe. And this information around policy is just showing where we need to resist and how we need to pour into each other. So if you have any questions about those new laws or policy, and those questions are not answered on the website, feel free to reach out to us at info@marijuanajustice.org, and we can let you know more of that information as that goes along. If you have not saved the date for our next Canna Justice Conference, it is a virtual conference in December. We had our first one last year, and we were really excited about that. And so we are continuing to invite speakers from all across the nation to give us an update around the decrim and legalization conversation. So save the date on that. Visit our website to see what happened last year. And speaking of voices that I'm really excited to highlight and would even love for more of these conversations for our conference even later. But I really want to get to our guests this week. And I just want to check the comments really quickly, but wanted to get to our guests this week because we have been working, as I told you all, with Justice Forward Virginia. They're a group in our Canna Justice Coalition. They're all public defenders, and they really have also been following the work of this national coalition that we're going to hear from in just a little bit, and what they're doing now, particularly around decriminalization of other drugs besides cannabis and weed, marijuana, whatever you want to call it. And just really looking at the criminalization piece as a whole, as a public health issue, as a survival issue, and what that means for us in the future. So I think it's really important that we always look at legalization as just a gateway to this conversation, because it's not just weed that we need to decriminalize and get free, because it's so much more in the system that's entangled with criminalization. So I'm really excited to introduce our panel, and I'm going to go ahead and say that I am just really excited to introduce Decrim Poverty, DC. Through ongoing advocacy, Decrim Poverty DC aims to replace carceral systems with harm reduction-oriented systems of care that promote dignity, autonomy, and health of people who use drugs, sex workers, and other criminalized populations. And so tonight we're going to discuss the important work of our panelists that they're doing around decriminalization, poverty, and sex work. So I'd like to bring all three of the panelists up right now, and I'm going to have them just introduce themselves. Hey, y'all. And because, time is here, I have said you can be on camera or not. So Tamika, if you need to stay off, that's totally fine. We're excited to have you on. Shane, Queen, thank y'all so much for coming on. I'm going to let you all introduce yourselves. Just let us know your name, your pronoun, what you do at your org, and then maybe just a short piece about what brought you to this work.
I'm happy to start. So my name is Queen Adasui. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior national policy manager with the Drug Policy Alliance, and I'm a core organizer with the Decrim Poverty DC campaign locally. There's a lot of reasons and things that brought me to this work, but the main factor is just myself being a survivor as a child, and the ways that cannabis for me held me throughout my childhood, through now. Honestly, cannabis saved my life. That's why it's really exciting for me and for us to be here to talk to you all about our broader campaign about decriminalizing substances beyond cannabis, because I think there's a huge role that cannabis enthusiasts have in the broader fight to end the war on drugs, because we need to constantly remind ourselves that marijuana legalization does not mean the end of the war on drugs. We have a huge fight beyond just legalizing marijuana and having dispensaries and things of that sort. So I'm really excited to connect these dots today with you all.
All right. Thank you so much, Queen. Who's up next?
Hello, my name is Tamika Spellman. I am the Policy and Community Engagement Manager for HIPS in Washington, D.C. I am one of the lead organizers on the Decrim Poverty Campaign, and I come into this space as a person of lived experience. I had quite a few years of chaotic drug using history, and I also started out with HIPS as a client. And I worked my way through the system at HIPS and became one of the managers over one of their departments. So I'm here today to express my angst and to tell my lived experiences with negative drug history and policies.
Thank you so much for being here, Tamika.
Hey, my name is Shane. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm the harm reduction coordinator at HIPS. It's hard to say like how I entered this work or HIPS, but I began as a volunteer in 2013. And I think like a lot of like queer folks, I was around a lot of people who were engaged in sex work and using drugs, and became staff in 2019, and am also involved with Decrim Poverty. Also, I'm here in part to leverage like my privilege, both in this role, but like just in general as somebody who uses like hard drugs or like more stigmatized drugs. So it's, yeah, me being here is like partly related to being in community personally, but also just witnessing how much loss we've sustained as an outreach worker in DC in the last few years. Like shit has always been fucked, but I think the last 3 years especially, fentanyl has really taken a toll on just this entire city, really. So
Thank you for that, Shane. And just because you've already kind of opened up the conversation a little bit, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you all do at HIPS and your organization.
Yeah, so I'm here right now, although this is just a window, but we have a drop-in and basically offer services Monday through Friday. And then there's also clinical services. I do outreach on our van, which goes out pretty much 6 days a week right now. We do overnights to reach people engaged in street-based sex work. We also reach a lot of unhoused people. And then I think the bulk of how that's funded really is like through syringe exchange. So we see a lot of people who are using drugs. More recently, we've been able to pass out safer smoking materials as well. But yeah, we see a lot of different types of folks for a lot of different reasons, but it's a lot of people engaged in street economies. And our aim is really to like provide what people need, but like focus on people who are most marginalized by the system, and especially the war on drugs and especially criminalization.
Thank you for that. Tamika, I know you're also with HIPS, and would you mind just, do you have anything to add to that, number one? And also tell us what HIPS stands for as well.
This is what it stands for. Always got my logo up somewhere, you know.
Wear your narrative. I love that. Yes.
Oh yeah, you know, I'm HIPS core through the core. You know, I've been around since their inception, which is almost 30 years now. You know, I've been around for quite a while. I've been a sex worker going into 4 decades. I'm at year number 39 as a sex worker and a person that have lived through. You know, I survived the crack epidemic through all this, and HIPS was very instrumental in helping me to survive through all of this. You know, as a person of lived experience that's been around since HIPS inception, you know, my colleague only touched on a few of the things that we do, you know, because we do so many things because there's a need in the community for an agency to meet the people where they're at, you know, and we have such a welcoming and, you know, we environment. We don't bar people, you know, anybody, we may tell them, hey, don't come back until tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow, baby. But it's like we don't have security. We don't see a need for it. We are our own security. We handle things internally. You know, we have a way of dealing with the population that we can de-escalate a situation that normally the police would just throw you in cuffs and take you to jail. This is the type of thing that HIPS is about. And that's just like in our normal everyday activities. You know, I'm in the policy and advocacy department. And that's where I do my business is to make sure that I'm representing for the interests of the people that come to HIPS. That when they bring something to me, I'm thinking constantly about how I can affect a policy or a law to change those circumstances that they're having to deal with.
Right.
You know, especially because I've lived through a lot of the things that they're still going through today. You know, I'm 56 years old. And I feel like because of the amount of things that I've seen and lived through and how I was able to circumvent it through the application of harm reduction, that it should be widely available and better known that these kind of tactics are available and that they do work.
Right, right. Thank you for tying the word harm reduction into exactly what you were just saying, because I was going to get you there so folks can hear that term and the coupling of what you're doing with policy to reduce that in the laws, and because of your connection and what you're seeing and living through. right? And that's why it's so important for anyone that has anything to do with policy to have this type of connection to the folks that are doing the work.
Absolutely.
Queen, over at DPA, tell us a little bit about Drug Policy Alliance and what you do over there. How you're connected to these folks.
Sure. So the Drug Policy Alliance is a national advocacy organization working to end the war on drugs and repair its harms. So we actually work both on the federal level and throughout states in the country. I have experience working on the federal level and locally as a person who also lives in Washington, D.C. So I've had the privilege of working alongside my colleagues over at HIPS to lead various campaigns locally to try to alleviate the harms of the war on drugs. So previously, before we launched the Decrim Poverty DC campaign, we led an effort to decriminalize drug paraphernalia, which at the time felt like the height of the overdose crisis. But like to what Shane is saying, I mean, every year it just keeps getting worse and worse. And it's really devastating to see how much worse it's gotten since even our initial efforts to try to decriminalize fentanyl testing kits. So previously, before we decriminalized drug paraphernalia, things like fentanyl testing kits were criminalized under paraphernalia laws. So literally, it would be illegal for a person to possess, or even community-based organizations like HIPS to distribute fentanyl testing kits at a time where our drug supply is so adulterated and people are continuing to accidentally die from fatal overdose. So back in 2018, we were able to make permanent an emergency measure to decriminalize fentanyl testing kits. But at the time, we were actually trying to decriminalize all harm reduction tools, which are criminalized under paraphernalia laws. It took 2 years and a pandemic to get DC Council to see this as a public health issue and to stop really leaning into their stigma when it comes to drugs and people who use drugs for us to successfully pass this law. But in 2020, in December, we were able to unanimously get DC Council to pass legislation that would decriminalize drug paraphernalia, which for us is harm reduction tools that are criminalized under those paraphernalia laws. So like Shane mentioned, HIPS and other organizations can give out safer smoking kits and snorting kits because people who use drugs don't necessarily only use syringes. And to only allow for community-based organizations to distribute syringes leaves a huge gap for both outreach workers, and it also allows for another tool for law enforcement to continue to harass people who use drugs in the city. So, building off of our campaign to decriminalize harm reduction tools that were criminalized under paraphernalia laws, we wanted to build out a broader decrim campaign because our communities are just overly criminalized, and it's getting in the way of people's well-being and health. And frankly, criminalization is making public health worse for individuals and communities. And that's why it's really important, again, for people who are in the marijuana justice space to recognize that there is a broader fight beyond cannabis in terms of ending the war on drugs. Just last year, we lost nearly 600 Washingtonians to overdose. That's the highest number we've ever seen since overdose rates have been recorded. And 86% of those deaths were of Black Washingtonians. So this is very much a racial justice issue. This is very much a public health issue. And our campaign, which is, really centered from an anti-poverty lens, just given the groups of folks in DC that are the most vulnerable and most devastated by these laws. That's why our campaign doesn't even have the word drugs in it. It's a broader effort to really decriminalize poverty. But it's why our campaign is fighting really hard to try to get DC Council to introduce our legislative proposal and to move on what we're asking for, which is treating drug use as a public health issue, aka not arresting people because they use or possess personal use quantities of drugs. And instead of wasting all of that money that they spend on enforcement and policing and harassing people, spend that same amount of energy, which is a lot, over to things like harm reduction centers, which would include overdose prevention programs and drug checking services and money for peer-led organizations like HIPS. So we can actually invest in the services and the people and communities that we know will help make everyone safer, regardless of a person's drug use or not. So that's kind of where we're coming from. But DPA works on really broad drug policy issues across the board.
Got you. No, yeah, you answered that really beautifully, and because my next question was really about decrim poverty and this campaign that you all are doing, and what you said about, we don't even, that's why we don't have the word drug even in our name and things like that. I think that's a really important way of why we start this conversation. And so I would love for, and it could come from anyone that wants to kind of jump in on this, of just why you all named this decrim poverty, like particularly the word poverty, I guess, is where people like, well, why does that come in there?
Well,
Y'all can take that away, but I was just going to show a safer snorting kit. I was looking for a smoking kit, but I found one of these. So it has like saline and straws, and then like a flat surface that you can sterilize before snorting. So yeah, this is what they look like. Anyway.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. And here in Richmond, River City Harm Redux are folks that you all can access here in Richmond for that same type of supplies. So we all need, the visuals are great. Don't y'all love it when they do that in like testimony and session and stuff? They like to hold up the visuals. I'm like, wow. So anyway, but Tamika, go ahead with what you were saying about the name.
Yes, the name really kind of came out of a vision for removing, not just removing the criminal penalties for what is to us a really poverty-related issue, but to also make this movement supportive of other poverty-related issues that are running concurrent. Like we are very, very active in the Defund MPD campaign, which is calling for a significant reduction in the amount of police and a redirection of those funds to community organizations, to different programming, education, and multitude of other things that we as city dwellers are demanding it be shifted to. And some of those things that we're also asking for would be the 24-hour harm reduction center. And HIPS has put together a plan to take the lead on that so that city government does not come in and, excuse me, but don't come in and fuck it up. Mm-hmm. Government has a tendency of starting programs and not effectively putting them together, putting people in place that are not effective at the job, and then shutting it down and saying it was an ineffective program. Well, you weren't doing it right. You're not qualified to take care of certain things. You should be shifting this off to people who are qualified by making it available through procurement contracts. We'll happily take it on and show y'all how to do it the right way. We're already doing quite a bit of the work that we're asking for to be undertaken. So it would be like a no-brainer for either HIPS or one of the other agencies that do this type of intense work to step in and lead the way. But It's also about how we're advocating around other issues. Like we are very active also in the Decrim Now campaign, which is to decriminalize sex work. And that is simply because sex workers are drug users. It's an intersection of identity. I'm in quite a few coalitions, community oversight of surveillance. That is an issue that people who use drugs encounter, where they're surveilled all the time, especially a lot of the people that are in our unhoused community that we deal with. Exactly. That's a huge issue. So it's like, if it's a poverty-related issue that is criminalized, it makes sense for us to try to work that into the same language that we're using to decriminalize the possession of drugs, because a lot of these things are resource-related problems that arrest and jail do not affect. You cannot arrest your way out of these problems. You can put the right resources in place to prevent them from happening. And that's where we fail as municipalities, is actually investing back into the community instead of investing in policing the community.
And that's really where it is, right? Because if we decriminalize it, aka stop putting money into criminalize it, then we'll have resources to put it where we need. It seems like simple math to me. No, I appreciate that answer, particularly as we talk about poverty and we talk about a collective movement, right? And you all are really making space for many people throughout the advocacy organizing world to come together and speak the same language. So that's really powerful and gives a place for people to show up in many capacities, even when they have low capacity. So I think that this is a really a great opportunity for us to all really mimic in our local areas as well. And in that vein, I'd like to hear a little bit about maybe some key challenges and love to hear the victories too, that you all have already encountered in this journey.
I would say, if I can jump in here, I will start with a couple of victories. One, in the last year, we've been able to build out a really strong coalition that's intersectional, that speaks of and with the community that's most impacted by the drug war here in DC. And I'm really proud of the coalition that we've been able to build and we're continuing to build. I think we're really speaking to hearts and minds in our coalition and with our campaign. So I see that as a victory. I think another victory I think is also just where Washingtonians are in terms of understanding that the status quo is not working. 83% of DC voters support decriminalizing drug possession. I believe it's actually 96% in Ward 8, which is the most impacted ward in DC. So, the people are already on our side. So I see our continuing mobilization of Washingtonians to amplify those voices as a victory. I think our biggest challenge is politics and lack of courage on behalf of the council members that we have right now. Because despite, the incredible polling, despite the incredible people power we have behind our campaign and our movement, and despite the urgency, frankly, behind how devastating overdose continues to be in our city, we're still looking for a sponsor. We're still looking for a person in DC Council to be courageous enough to introduce our proposal. And we're really close with a couple folks. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to secure an introduction relatively soon. But I would say one of the biggest hurdles is fear. That's really not informed or backed by anything, because, what else do you need besides the evidence and the science, all the lived experiences, the support that people say they will offer you if you support something like this? The majority of Washingtonians, and frankly, the majority of Americans, know that the war on drugs is a failure. And, for whatever reason, politicians and elected officials are really nervous about taking steps towards actually ending the war on drugs. And I think what's the most difficult part about advocating in DC is that folks will say that they know drug use is a public health issue. They will say that the war on drugs is a failure, but they won't take the next step to end that. I think that's probably even worse than like a person who's like delusional about the war on drugs still. So it's like really trying to get our politicians to meet us where we are and take this serious, because frankly, we're losing more people to overdose than we are to homicide. It's a serious state of emergency that we're in. So we're just going to continue to make this clearer to them that we are in a state of emergency and they need to act now.
Wow. Losing more people to overdose than to homicide. These numbers are really, they're hitting my heart. And it, like you said, the delusion behind not acting behind it when you supposedly have the power to do so, and at least freaking propose it, introduce it. But yeah. All right, Shane, go ahead.
I was going to say it's like a victory and not in that privately, and even on the record, a lot of people on the council and people in positions of power support decrim, support OPSs, support everything that we're talking about, but then won't take that step. And I think it speaks to a lot of different things, but partly like there is a vested interest to continue the war on drugs by law enforcement, and that's not going to change. And we have a mayor who's going to be reelected in November who wants to increase the police force, even though per capita DC already has the highest rate of officers per civilians of any major city. And is not an ally to any of this. So their budget is already $560 million. They end up spending more than that based on what Mayor Bowser decides a lot of cases. I just think there's a lot of like infrastructural power that prevents forward movement, even though, so it's not enough that 83% of folks support this unless it becomes an urgent enough issue that like we keep driving it home. And it's very frustrating in the sense, like Queen said, we're losing so many people, and this is not unique to DC. Like Baltimore is not far, and I believe that they have the highest overdose rate of any major city, which isn't really talked about at all, but it's an enormous amount of people who are lost every single year. And then the record nationally was nearly 108,000 people died from fatal overdose. A lot of the same populations of like older Black men who traditionally used heroin in DC, but also an increase in younger folks who are using maybe like recreationally or less often, but were being sold oxy or other opioids on the street. Most of that supply now, including for Virginia, or at least Northern Virginia, is fentanyl or contains fentanyl. So yeah, but our fight is framing that in a way that doesn't lead to more conversations about stopping like things at the border, because we know that does not work. And we have a really great example that Tamika mentions often in the case of prohibition of alcohol. It's pretty much the same thing as far as I'm concerned. So
Exactly. And that is where I wanted to chime in, is that this is a logical next step after getting paraphernalia decriminalized. And the step from this one is to actually start looking at the supply and starting to put in the regulations like we did when we had alcohol prohibition. If people look back in history, we are having the same issues that we had with alcohol prohibition when it comes to the drug supply coming into this country. And that includes all of the criminal activity that came around with it. And it was because it was criminalized adult behavior. And this is where we as a country keep getting things wrong. We should be looking at sensible regulation of it and having safe distribution supplies like we do with alcohol. People were making bathtub gin back in Prohibition, and that bathtub gin was killing people. So instead of letting that keep going on, they did the right thing. Legalize it, put some structure in place, and be able to make sure that you can trace where the bad supply comes from. That's all we're asking for. The distribution site for alcohol are the liquor stores. The safe consumption sites for alcohol are either in your home or at a bar. If we could move towards socializing social drugs, because that's exactly what they are. Drugs are social, just like alcohol and marijuana. If we can move towards that direction, we could get greater safety and completely eradicate overdose. But we have these legislators up on Capitol Hill that are fearful of the unknown. We already know what we have. We have a problem, a huge problem. And their inaction is creating this chasm where we keep letting people fall through the cracks and deaths keep occurring. It's not going to stop until it hits home with one of them.
just to add to that really quickly, that includes people self. I think that the shift is becoming recognizing people who use drugs as like victims is the narrative that's being framed. but a lot of people who sell drugs also use drugs. Local drug dealers are not people who are adulterating the supply in the first place. They're being scapegoated. So this is why I think when we're proposing decrim, it's important to have people who use drugs as part of the panel or like the committee that is in the proposal that we crafted, as being at the table to talk about what that threshold should look like. Because if it's low, or if it's at a certain rate, then people are still going to be targeted, and the same level of enforcement can happen. It'll just happen to people who sell drugs more. And I have no interest in like demonizing people who are, again, this is related to poverty, who are trying to survive by selling drugs.
Yeah, thank you for that. So much was said right there, and I think some key things that stuck with me is just going even back to the way you all framed victories. None of that was in policy. So just remembering that the victories are with the people, y'all. Also, just really who's at the table to talk about how to regulate these things. If we have not seen that example in cannabis, y'all, we really should have learned this. That was a very interesting example as we go through all of these things. And just really making sure that we're moving forward with the decrim. And my next question is, as we're moving forward and, the state of affairs right now does not feel great for anybody. I don't think in any of the work that anyone is doing doesn't feel so much hopeful. If I can be transparent. But the fact that you all have such a strong coalition and doing so much, what are you all talking about as far as how to keep the progress going and maybe even preparing for any back steps like that? As was mentioned in the earlier opening of Marijuana Monthlies in Virginia, we are now just looking at a step backwards with the marijuana possession, with the recriminalization, with some misdemeanors. So we know that happens. That's part of the reform world, right? And why we need to abolish all of this. But what is I guess some of you all's plans or just thoughts behind managing this back and forth of power that we've got that really impacts our people?
I think one thing we have to continue to keep in mind is that despite the urgency and despite our desire, I mean, this is going to have to be a multi-year campaign. And remembering our strengths in both our grassroots strategies, our base building strategies, and the policy strategy. So I think as of now, our coalition and the folks who are really leading this campaign, they're not ready to compromise. We're not in a position to compromise. So we are still moving forward with trying to get our full proposal introduced, especially because it's not necessarily the substance of the issue that's the problem. It's really just lack of urgency, lack of courage. And I think as we continue our base building efforts, we're just going to continue to make it more clear how urgent this is. So beefing up our direct actions and being much louder about the urgency. I think, we just can't afford to compromise, especially when we know what compromise would mean and who it would leave behind. It feels really messed up to compromise, especially at this point of our campaign. So we're just going to continue to fight. And our goal is to hopefully secure an introduction by the fall and then move on with the legislative process. But again, keeping in mind that we're leading not just a legislative campaign, but a grassroots campaign. And the expansion of our work within our communities is just as important as any of the policy advances. So that's going to continue regardless of what politicians are doing or not doing. So as our voices get louder in our communities, it's going to be harder for politicians to rely on their lack of courage. Because a lot of times these politicians are worried about opposition and like random flyers that they're getting blamed for crime and stuff. The crime narrative. Yeah, the crime narrative across the country and in DC is like having these politicians in a chokehold. Like, it's very unfortunate. But I think the folks, and we're in the majority, it's the majority of people who support, what we're advocating for. So I think we just have to continue to build out our tools to make sure that we're amplifying our voices louder than the minority of opposition that these politicians are all scared about.
Yeah, I think I just want to say real fast, Tamika, before you jump in, that by the time, they get their political courage, y'all have like 100% support across the community. The community be completely bought in. Go ahead, Tamika.
Yeah, Queen said it the nice way. I'm just going to say it like it really is. We getting ready to put that full court press on. We getting ready to apply the pressure. We're going to dial the direct actions up against the legislating body. We're going to start showing up at their doors. And then we're really going to ramp it up when it comes to the engagement with the community. We have a couple of surprises. When these people come out, they're going to really be engaging with us in this movement. People are tired of how the police are treating folks, and they see the value in moving towards a health-based approach. And it's time that we get these legislators to start paying attention. These are the people that elected y'all. These are the folks that you have to depend on to re-elect you. And I'm going to make it my business to make sure that they remember what you didn't do. So it's time to apply the pressure.
Echoing Queen and Tamika, partly just because I've learned so much from y'all, but I think, I'm done with propaganda and I think calling out that bullshit for what it is. There was an article in the Washington Post that identified there was a spate of overdoses recently, and cocaine was listed as the primary substance that was adulterated. And it was reported by law enforcement that was the case. I found out later that's not true. I think it was a highly potent batch of fentanyl, but they just make shit up. And that article is still live. And that type of disinfo is incredibly harmful. Why not ask us? I mean, there's a lot of clear reasons why they're not asking us, but as much as we can, we do try to push back, because that is the narrative that people are being fed right now. And it's really, really harmful.
And if I could just add, what's on our side is the truth and evidence. And I think oftentimes politicians are worried about what an older elder in the community may say or think about the concept of decriminalizing drugs. But frankly, when you talk to people, really rationalize with people what we're currently doing and how it's not working, it makes sense. This is common sense policy. And what Tamika said, what the future and hopefully a near future of what it will look like to actually regulate substances. What we're proposing right now is very much harm reduction. This is not the gold star. This is not the end of the drug war either, but it's very much a huge step towards reducing the current drug-related harms that we're seeing in our communities. And if you just talk to people see the vision. The last place someone who actually is struggling with addiction should be is a cage. It's literally immoral and unethical to throw someone who you perceive, or whether they have it or not, are struggling with a substance use disorder. The last place they should be is jail. And something that folks continue to forget is that the majority of people who use substances beyond cannabis do not qualify as having a substance use disorder. It's only a minority of folks who are struggling at any moment with a substance use disorder, oftentimes dealing with other co-occurring issues that are being unmet. That's why it's important to invest in harm reduction, because it provides the capacity to meet people where they are and provide them with the resources that they may need. So instead of focusing on their drug use, maybe focus on the fact that a person may need somewhere to sleep. Someone may need food. There are other reasons why people end up struggling with drug use. And frankly, a lot of times people are trying to escape their reality. And if we are actually investing in the people and the resources in the communities that can speak to a person and try to figure out why a person is trying to escape their reality, we will make it so people are making different choices. And they are less likely to die from their choices related to drugs. but to just force someone who's struggling on all different levels to be abstinent, like that's supposed to like be an elevated state of being compared to actually investing in the things that they may need. It just gives politicians and elected officials a cop out from actually investing in the things that we need in our community. So, I think it's a failure on politicians to continue to like sit in their fear that's really unfounded, and instead just do the work of recognizing what the evidence shows, recognizing what the lived experiences of people who are most impacted by these policies continue to say. And frankly, to stop ignoring the voices of the most vulnerable, including our unhoused community members, sex workers, the populations that we are continuing to mobilize because of the ways that their voices are continue to be ignored by our elected officials.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And if anyone does have questions, please drop them in. We just have a couple more minutes if you're watching right now. And this video will be up on our YouTube Living. This is normally the time to I mention and remind folks that the reason why I show up here is because I was a child that was impacted by the drug war, but also was a practicing social worker for 10 years. And that resources and the meeting people where we are and all the things that I was taught to do, I did not have the resources or capabilities to even support people. And that is how I end up here in policy to try and tear some of that down and revert and reshift some of these policies and money and narratives too. So, it's so many people out there that are trying to do this work. And just the barriers of these policies passing are really creating, I can't even think it's so late, but just the inability for people to meet folks where they are and to provide services, right? Like I can be the best social worker in the world, but if I don't have a place to house someone for the night, then how am I ever going to do this? It doesn't even matter about me being here. And I'm a support for folks and so many things of why people are not able to access what they need are a lot of times because they use drugs or they have a criminal record due to drugs or they live in a place where drug use is high. And so it's just so many things that I just wanted to lift up of what you're saying as why this decrim poverty conversation, it hits so many folks and why when you have a conversation with someone about it, it's a very easy, sensible conversation. We are running towards the end of this. Tamika, did you have something you wanted to mention?
I just wanted to say a couple more things. I as a person that has a lived experience, being arrested did not help me one iota. Having that harm reduction agency keep saying, have you went to see anybody about your mental health? Have you considered maybe, reducing the amount that you're using or putting some barriers in place to help you to get your chaotic use under control? They didn't come at me with the approach that the courts came at with abstain or else go to jail. That's very coercive. That wasn't helpful. Making me go and take urinalysis was not helpful. I wasn't ready to quit. Going to AA, NA, and CA did not help me. It only helps a certain part of the population. And I did not believe in the abstinence only. I had a chaotic problem with crack cocaine. But guess what? I can smoke marijuana and I can drink today without it making my life chaotic because I actually went and fixed that hole in my body and my soul that was making me and compelling me to use chaotically. And that was because I went and addressed the mental health problem I had. I had a lot of issues. I was a transgender woman in a time and a space when people didn't want to give me a job. So my work history was erratic. My housing was unstable for many years. I have not been this is the most stable I have ever been in my life. And that was because HIPS took a chance on somebody and did not care about my drug use because I was capable of doing the work. And that's all that a person's ability should be based on to do a job, is their ability to complete the task. Not having housing was a barrier. And it's continued to be a barrier for a lot of people that use drugs. And a lot of these leases can't even smoke on the property no more. That's not helpful to people. It's another barrier to making people homeless.
You are so correct. So many things I could continue to go there, and that just means that we might have to have y'all back in some capacity. Before we let you all go, I'd love to just hear a little bit about how folks can follow this campaign, how they can support you all, and then just drop all the good socials and websites. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll just say follow us on Twitter, Decrim Poverty DC. That's our Twitter handle. Our campaign website is decrimpovertydc.org. And I think most folks who are watching live in Virginia. If you're close by or have family or friends in DC, please consider supporting us even on a volunteer basis. Like Tamika mentioned, especially over the next several weeks, we're gonna be out in the streets. So we'll need lots of people power. So your solidarity would be really welcomed. But otherwise, I think beyond just supporting us in a tangible way, whether it's, research support, volunteering, base building kind of support, is working in your own community to try to alleviate or reduce the amount of stigma that's around you. Because every person who's doing that work, it builds up and it helps propel our overall movement. When we see, efforts moving across different areas, that helps everyone else. So when New York City opened up their the 2 overdose prevention centers, the first overdose prevention centers that opened up in the country, all of their progress is helpful for us here, and it's helpful for other advocates across the country. So doing the work where you live also helps others. So that's how I think you can support us.
And that Linktree has, a shit ton of more info, but it has our listserv too. So events and everything like that are updated to that.
Perfect. And yeah, for Nova folks, I really, like you said, these borders are all made. Oh, go ahead, Queen.
So DC is not a state, as folks know. So our campaign actually is also a federal issue. So tell your senators and your representatives to leave DC alone and to remove the rider that's been blocking DC not only from being able to regulate cannabis. As folks know, we legalized cannabis since 2014 and we still don't have a regulated market. But that same rider actually is broader than cannabis. So it doesn't allow DC to regulate, decriminalize, or reduce criminal penalties for any scheduled substance. So for our, the language has been reinterpreted by our Attorney General. So we're able to actually introduce a bill and move it along and actually pass it in DC Council. But in order for us to actually make this law, the decrim piece, to make the Schedule 1 substance decriminalized, we'll need to have that rider lifted out of the appropriations bill in Congress. So because DC is not a state, we have Congress people on the House and Senate legislating basically for DC through the appropriations process. So you actually can advocate for us on the federal level by telling your member of Congress on both sides to leave us alone and to lift the Harris rider.
All right. So if you need any information about who your reps are, let us know. And for Virginia, the Senate, that's Warner and Kane. So hit them up, let them know. Thank you all so much for that. And I just really wanted to say thank you all for being here. We try and do this every single month, but we are going to take a break next month here in August. And just make sure that you all are supporting us here at Marijuana Justice Virginia, THC Justice Now, and check out our website. We have got the new laws and things up for Virginia. If you have any questions, please reach out. Again, big thank you to our guests, Shane, Queen, and Tamika from Decrim Poverty DC. The work is really inspiring. We've learned so much, and I'm continuing to learn from you all. I don't think I said this live, but in case you were wondering, yes, absolutely. When you look at some of their work here and you see the marijuana justice bill that was passed and things like that, that's absolutely where the name of this group came from, and was really inspired by the work of folks that are on this call and the works of DPA that have been doing this work for years. So it only makes sense that we continue this work here in Virginia now with the evolution of Decrim Poverty to really lift our people for liberation. I'm Chelsea Higgs Wise with Marijuana Justice VA. Thanks so much for being here, y'all. Catch you later.
Thank you.